new reporting suggests that special counsel Robert Mueller may have evidence of possible collusion between the Trump campaign and Russia, and that the investigation into a conspiracy or quid pro quo between Donald Trump's campaign and the Russians is alive and kicking. Testimony from one of Mueller's top deputies delivered behind closed doors and in front of a judge in Paul Manafort's case is akin to a unicorn sighting. It's a rare transcript of a Mueller prosecutor describing, in his own words, one of the investigative theories around the question of conspiracy. That theory, according to the Times analysis, quote, starting while Russia was taking steps to bolster Mr. Trump's candidacy, people in his orbit were discussing deals to end a dispute over Russia's incursion into Ukraine and possibly give Moscow relief from economic sanctions imposed by the United States and its allies. The Times goes on to describe how the theory suggested by prosecutor Andrew Weissmann was described as, quote, almost an aside in a conversation about how Manafort had lied about his conversations with an operative linked to Russian intelligence. When pressed by the judge, Weissmann reveals this, quote, this goes to the larger view of what we think is going on and what we think is the motive here, Mr. Weissmann said. This goes, I think, very much to the heart of what the special counsel's office is investigating. Democratic Congressman Adam Schiff also making clear in an appearance on Meet the Press yesterday that he, too, is focused on Trump-Russia ties.
What we're interested in is, does the president have business dealings with Russia such that it compromises the United States? And the perfect example is something we know about already, and that is, as a presidential candidate, while he was telling the country he had no business dealings with Russia, he was pursuing the most lucrative deal, I think, of his life and seeking the Kremlin's help to make it happen. That's a different form of collusion, but it is equally compromising to the country because it means the president of the United States is looking out for his bank account and not for the United States of America.
And that is where we start today with some of our favorite reporters and friends. Frank Figliuzzi is a former assistant director for counterintelligence at the FBI. Aaron Blake, senior political reporter for The Washington Post, is back at the table. Vanity Fair senior reporter Emily Jane Fox, former federal prosecutor Glenn Kirshner, and Axios political reporter Alexi McCammon is here on a scoop streak that we're going to get to in a little bit. Frank, let me start with you. This was described to me today as a unicorn sighting, a transcript of the elusive Mueller prosecutor, one of his top deputies in the special counsel investigation, describing one of the investigative theories. If you could translate that for our viewers.
This is a rare insight into the mind of the special counsel. So we've now got a glimpse of the bigger picture and an admission, a concession that what they're working on is something involving akin to a quid pro quo. You do this for me, we do this for you. Now we're left to fill in the blanks. What is it we're doing for each other? This smells an awful lot like we help you with policy regarding Ukraine and or Crimea. You help us get this election done. That's what this is looking like to me, and to hear it straight from the mouth of a lead prosecutor on the special counsel's team is something we all need to stand up and pay attention to.
Frank, I don't want to put you on the spot, but this is something you've been reaching toward, pointing toward whenever we've had public-facing evidence that suggests not only you, but you and Glenn and Jeremy Bash and others have warned us to look out for this as one of the theories. How much of a revelation is it to you that they've got this in their sights?
I'm going to be honest with you. I, from day one, have tried to keep on track with the notion that this special counsel inquiry was always all about counterintelligence. It was always about the degree to which the Russians influenced the campaign. So to hear this from Weissmann, it's almost something I glossed over, because we know that this has always been the core of the investigation. So, but I'm telling you, linking this now to Manafort has added significance. We've talked, Nicole, on this show about the theory that he's that infection vector that brought the Russian infection to the campaign, among others. And I think for me, the meaning of this is confirmation that Manafort is one of those vectors that brought the Russians into play.
So I just want to stay with this, Frank. This hearing was about what Manafort did to lose his cooperation agreement. He lied. So he lied about these conversations that we're talking about right here. And I just want to put up a list about all the other people that lied about conversations about Russian sanctions, because if this thread is central to the question, these are all the other people who form spokes of the wheel. Michael Flynn lied about conversations with Ambassador Kislyak about sanctions. Paul Manafort, we've been talking about, lied about conversations with Kilimnik about sanctions. Jared Kushner was not truthful about conversations about a UN vote. Donald Trump Jr. lied about conversations with Veselnitskaya in that Trump Tower meeting. We said it was about adoption. It, too, was about sanctions. So this isn't just about an American presidential campaign talking to Russians about easing sanctions. This is about 1, 2, 3, 4 individuals lying about the conversations they had with Russians about easing sanctions.
So we've always focused on the why of the lie. Why keep lying? Why multiple people lying essentially about the same thing, Russia? And, what we've got to do is move beyond just self-profit, right? This is all about bucks in my pocket. I need to lie to cover up the fact that I was trying to personally profit from my relationships with Russia and my position on a campaign. That's good to a certain extent, but if you're going to lie and put yourself in federal prison and jeopardize your family, your career, your reputation, what's bigger than just personal profit? It's the notion, perhaps, Nicole, that what you're covering up is actual assistance from a foreign adversary to assist the campaign and get Trump elected. To me, that's a plausible explanation for people jeopardizing their freedoms repeatedly, lest they be labeled traitors at the hands of a foreign adversary.
So, Glenn, this was floated to me toward the end of the year. Watch and wait for them to say, he was a businessman, of course he was doing. Watch for the defense to become the thing they've denied, because the truth is worse. And again, they're not even denying, because they've now pleaded guilty to these contacts with Russians. They now have this web of this is a campaign whose defense to collusion is we couldn't collude with our press office. That's what Brad Pascal and Jared Kushner say when asked if they colluded. Oh, you silly, silly reporters. We couldn't even collude with headquarters. They have now managed to coordinate the same lie up and down the campaign chain of command. How'd they do that if they couldn't collude with their press office?
Yeah, they could collude. They were colluding. And all of this is so nefarious. It's not reckless. It's not happenstance. It's not careless. I agree with everything Frank said. And what I found really remarkable in what Andrew Weissmann was saying to the court when they were trying to decide whether Paul Manafort's plea agreement should basically be torn up because he lied. As a cooperating witness, he kept lying to the special counsel.
How reckless is that?
I had a nickname at the U.S. Attorney's Office in D.C. I was the king of the cooperators, and that's not a compliment. It really isn't.
No.
It's almost a criticism, because cooperating witnesses are just notoriously difficult people to keep on board, to keep focused on telling only the truth. What I find remarkable is Manafort gets charged, right? Federally indicted. What does he do after that? He starts tampering with witnesses, and he was charged for tampering with witnesses. After that, we have now learned through this litigation, albeit in highly redacted form, that he continued to conspire with Kilimnik. What is it that they so desperately want to cover up? I think Weissmann gave us a little bit of a preview. He said, we're talking about Paul Manafort lying about his continued conversations with Kilimnik. And what that does, Your Honor, it goes right to the heart of what the special counsel is investigating. And he basically said out loud what we have all been seeing, as Frank says, in all of this evidence. The concentric circles are tightening and tightening, and I think it's going to get to Russian conspiracy with the Trump campaign once it all comes to light.
Aaron Blake, you write about this. This is squarely in your wheelhouse. I want to posit a question, a theory that was floated to me by someone on the political side of the question here. We don't know exactly what the document was that was allegedly handed from Manafort to Kilimnik, but if it was, publicly available polling data, I can't imagine we'd be having these conversations. Is it possible that it was something like a voter file? I mean, the only thing you get of value from a political party when you become the nominee is the voter file. And what that is all the personal data of all of your potential voters. It's sort of the the Magna Carta of electoral politics. And when you become the nominee, you get addresses, and probably these days you get. I'm old enough to remember when it was just addresses and phone numbers, and you go knocking door to door. These days it's probably a lot more high tech. We don't know exactly what it was that was handed over, but these questions and these threads could answer a whole lot of those kinds of questions.
Yeah, and I think this brings us back to exactly what we were talking about before, which is why the cloak and dagger? Why is there a need to lie about these things if, in fact, they are not so nefarious? I think the key with Paul Manafort, as we've been saying, is not that he is the latest person to have allegedly lied in this whole situation, but he did it after he was already in a cooperation agreement, after he had so much at stake and said he was going to be cooperating here. We wouldn't have known about all this, by the way, if it weren't for some shoddy redactions from Paul Manafort's legal team, where they basically revealed, in fact, what Mueller's team thought he had been lying about. So we may not be in the same situation as we are right now if it weren't for that. But I think that it's clear from that document where the redactions were not significant enough, and now from this document, that this is a central part of the counterintelligence probe, and that not just that, but also that Mueller is very much focused on that counterintelligence portion of the probe.
Emily, I want to turn to your reporting, and it feels like this moment represents sort of the multiple spears pointing directly at Donald Trump. The other big one is really all the cases out of the Southern District of New York. A senior law enforcement official described your reporting, not necessarily what I found the juiciest stuff about the relationship between Melania and Stephanie Wolkoff. Yeah. But her knowledge, obviously what she's shared with the Southern District of New York about the money. More money flowed into Donald Trump's inaugural committee than flowed into President Obama's inaugural committee or George W. Bush's. There is such a flashing red flag. The Times has reported on unknown numbers of pro-Russian Ukrainians mulling about. Talk about your reporting and the threat it represents.
So we published a report last week based off of hundreds of documents I reviewed, emails, text messages, just showing concerns that were raised throughout the inauguration about inaugural spending, where money was going, where money was being spent, questioning budgets, questioning the involvement of the Trump family, and questioning how inaugural funds were going to the Trump organization. And this is why I think the inauguration, and as same goes with a number of investigations in the Southern District of New York, I think this is why it is so central. It combines the Trump family, the Trump organization, and the beginnings of the Trump administration. And so this is...
And the Russia question.
And the Russia question. And other foreign influence as well. As we know from reports over the last month, investigators in the Southern District of New York are also looking into and have subpoenaed documents based on foreign investment coming into the inauguration. So all of the questions that we have about a number of investigative threads that are going on are sort of playing out within the inauguration. And I think this is such a deep threat to all the things that the Trumps hold dear. And I think that there is so much more left to come.
Frank, can you just jump in? And it almost sounds dumb to say this out loud, but I've never been afraid to sound dumb on TV. It seems like for all of the, fast and loose, and Alexi's got more schedules from Trump White House that's leaking in the midst of a mole hunt, nice mole hunt. But, they were so fast and loose as a transition. They were so fast and loose as a White House. It seems like the fastest and the loosest operation, where there was potentially the most risk for criminal exposure, was the inauguration. If you're a federal prosecutor, what are you looking for?
Well, and what's also interesting, Nicole, is we're talking about this topic of just Trump being surrounded by people who are in it for their own profit. And so the question that prosecutors are going to focus on, and by the way, whether it's looking at the inaugural, whether it's looking at the Russian influence and Manafort and Flynn, is there more to it than personal profit? Is there a self-enrichment? Is there a violation of election laws? Is there money laundering? For example, there's reporting from Vanity Fair that at least $1.5 million went directly from the Trump Inaugural Committee to the Trump Hotel. That's just from that account. So this constant funneling of funds, that's one thing, but prosecutors are also going to be focused on whether people walked away with millions of dollars that were earmarked by donors for the inauguration and instead lined the pockets of staff members and organizers. That's going to be the focus of the inquiry.
Alexei, I want to read you something from Emily's piece, because there's a cultural piece of all this that's revealed. The Trump culture was so... Everyone was recording each other. Everyone was leaking on each other. Let me read this and we'll talk about it. Cohen let Wolkoff know that this is Michael Cohen, that among other documents and recordings, the FBI had seized hours of their own conversations that he had taped. In some of them, Wolkoff detailed her own contemporaneous concerns with the inauguration about how money was being spent, the general chaos of the process, and the involvement of Trump's adult children. During these conversations, Wolkoff also raised her issues with the two men in charge of the committee, Deputy Campaign Chairman Rick Gates and inaugural chair Tom Barrack. These recordings in part led the Southern District of New York to launch a criminal investigation into how the inaugural committee spent its record $107 million. They're just characters from other spin-offs. So you've got Gates, who's central to the Mueller investigation. You've got Barrack, who's central to all these New York-based questions about the committee. You've got a culture of people who recorded their conversations so that when the FBI raided their offices, oh, here you go, I mean, what does this group look like under the scrutiny, which is really normal scrutiny for a White House reporter onto a White House?
I mean, it looks like it's a mess, right? And it looks like they know that other people are being sort of shisty in the way that they're handling things, are sketchy. I mean, I'm not recording conversations with people outside of a professional situation, right, if you're doing reporting. But right. I would imagine we're not recording calls or conversations with our friends or in seemingly personal, familial situations. But that suggests to me that they know, based on their own actions and the actions they are witnessing of everyone around Trump's orbit, that they were doing things in a way that were going to be potential legal problems in the future, whether they recognize it at the time or not. I mean, it's just not normal. And, you know, another thing about this whole inauguration mess is we know, based on reporting last week at Axios, that the House Intelligence Committee, Democrats led by Adam Schiff, are also looking into the Trump family business. And that matters because they are marching right over that red line that President Trump said they would be crossing if they looked into his past and his family business. And I think that presents larger problems for not just the inauguration, but for President Trump himself.
Glenn, how much of this was a sort of premeditated conspiracy to defraud potentially the inauguration voters, to do pay-to-play with the pro-Russian Ukrainians? I mean, what does this look like once prosecutors start lining up this conduct and this evidence, like these materials that Emily describes that were seized in Cohen's offices, against the laws?
You know, there are a few possibilities, and I think ultimately the Southern District of New York prosecutors will get to all of those possibilities. But it could be a combination of things. It could be some pay for play. It could be that foreign nations were unlawfully contributing to the Trump inaugural committee in order to gain influence. The three big questions are: where did the money come from? How was the money spent? And was there the quid pro quo, the fancy term lawyers like to use for you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. But it could also be sort of within that. It could be some of these players in the inaugural committee trying to grab money for themselves. I think it's going to be hard to show this as one overarching conspiracy. That's just my sense from somebody who's handled RICO cases. I have a feeling there's
hearing that. What's RICO?
RICO is racketeer influenced and corrupt organizations. It's when you have an organization that is basically dedicated to working together to commit crimes. And then they commit what we call racketeering acts. They do a series of things in order to fulfill that criminal purpose. So I don't know that the inaugural committee piece is going to be that sort of coherent conspiracy. It feels to me like a lot of people were kind of in it for what they could get out of it. But the Southern District of New York will probably tell us at the completion of their investigation.
I'm smiling because I feel like you're saying they were too incompetent to do a RICO thing.
Or all too darn greedy in and of themselves. One or the other.
All right. See, I feel like at the end of this, I should learn. I get some sort of honorary law degree. Frank Fig.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me, or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.